Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was on one of those damp and dreary London evenings in November of 1895 that I found myself once again seated before the fire at 221 B. Baker Street, perusing the evening paper, while my companion, Sherlock Holmes, stared out into the swirling mist beyond the window. The gas lamps cast a feeble glow upon the glistening cobblestones, and the occasional silhouette of a passing cab appeared and vanished like a spectre in the gloom. Holmes had been uncharacteristically restless that day, pacing the floor with his long fingers steepled before him, his mind evidently craving a problem worthy of his talents. It was a state I had observed before, one that I knew would soon drive him to distraction unless fate intervened with some new intrigue. "You see, Watson," he muttered suddenly without turning. "It is upon nights such as these that the greatest mysteries unfold. The very air is pregnant with secrets, and yet here we sit, idle as clerks on a holiday." I was about to respond when there came the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps on the stair. A moment later, the bell rang sharply. Holmes turned to me with a glimmer of interest in his keen eyes. "Ah," he murmured, "perhaps fortune is not so unkind after all." Holmes had barely finished speaking when Mrs. Hudson entered, her expression one of mild disapproval. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced, before stepping aside to admit the visitor. As I folded my paper, Holmes, with an air of casual amusement, turned his attention to me instead of the newcomer. "Before he utters a word, Watson," he said, "allow me to make a few observations." I sighed, knowing I was once again to be the subject of his impromptu amusement. "You have spent the afternoon at your club," he began. "The slight indentation on your sleeve suggests a recently removed cufflink, but only on one arm, indicating you hastily dressed for supper. There is a faint smudge of ink on your forefinger, an indication that you have penned some notes. And of course, your choice of the Pall Mall Gazette instead of the Times betrays a desire for lighter reading this evening." I shook my head in exasperation. "Really, Holmes, must you make me feel like a schoolboy before company?" Holmes only chuckled. "It is merely to sharpen the faculties, my dear Watson. But enough of our little diversions. Let us hear what brings our guest to this doorstep." The man who stepped forward was of middle height, his dark suit well tailored but slightly dishevelled, as though he had dressed in haste. His hair, though neatly combed, bore signs of frequent running fingers, and there was a nervous energy about him, a quick darting of the eyes, a stiffness in his bearing. I trust I am addressing Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, his accent unmistakably American. Holmes inclined his head. "You have found him, sir, and this is my friend and associate, Doctor. Watson, please be seated. You seem troubled." The man exhaled, lowering himself into the chair opposite Holmes. "James Waywright," he introduced himself. "I have come to you, sir, because I am being followed." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. "Followed by whom, Mr. Waywright?" The man hesitated. I am not certain, but I know they mean me harm." I studied him carefully. He was clearly a man accustomed to concealing his thoughts, yet something about his apprehensive glances suggested a deeper fear. Holmes, I saw, had already noted the inconsistencies in his demeanour. His steely gaze never wavered. "I see," Holmes said softly. "Then tell me, sir, why is it that, though you claim to be pursued, you have not once looked behind you since entering this room?" Wainwright started at Holmes's remark, his fingers tightening briefly on the arms of the chair. I beg your pardon." Holmes smiled faintly, tapping his fingertips together. "You claim to be followed, yet I observe no signs of a man who has been constantly checking over his shoulder. Your collar is still crisply pressed, your shoes carry no excessive mud, and though your hands tremble now, they did not when you reached for your pocket watch a moment ago. Fear is a peculiar thing, Mr. Wainwright. It leaves its own evidence." The American's lips pressed into a thin line. He hesitated before exhaling heavily. "You are right, Mr. Holmes. I have not told you the entire truth." Holmes gave a small nod of satisfaction. "That much was evident from the moment you entered. The question remains, what is it that you are truly hiding?" The room fell silent for a moment, save for the distant clip-clop of horseshoe against wet pavement outside. Then, leaning forward, Wainwright lowered his voice. "Very well," he murmured. "I will tell you everything, but you must understand, Mr. Holmes. What I am about to say could mean life or death." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "My dear sir," he said with quiet amusement, "you have no idea how frequently I hear those very words." The steady drizzle of rain drummed against the window panes as Sherlock Holmes lounged in his chair, fingers interlocked beneath his chin, his expression one of practiced indifference. I had seen him in such moods before, his mind restless, craving a challenge that the mundane cases of late had failed to provide. It was in this moment of quiet that our visitor arrived. The door to our sitting room burst open, and in stepped a man of middle years, his features sharp, his hair neatly combed but showing signs of stress. His suit, though expensive, bore the unmistakable creases of one who had spent the night in anxious movement rather than restful sleep. His eyes darted about the room before finally settling on Holmes. "You must be Sherlock Holmes," he said, his voice bearing the clipped efficiency of an American accent. "I need your help. I'm in danger." Holmes regarded him with cool amusement. "Indeed, sir. And what form does this peril take?" The man hesitated, then lowered his voice. "I'm being followed." Holmes leaned forward slightly, the first flicker of true interest appearing in his keen eyes. "Fascinating. And who precisely is pursuing you, Mr. Wainwright? James Wainwright." He swallowed hard. "And that's just it, Mr. Holmes. I don't know who they are. But they mean to kill me." Holmes tapped his fingers together, his gaze fixed upon our visitor with the same cool detachment he reserved for particularly intricate puzzles. "Come now, Mr. Wainwright," he said. "A man does not find himself hunted without knowing why." Wainwright's jaw tightened. "I assure you, sir, I am as much in the dark as you are." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Indeed? Then let us examine what we do know. You are an American businessman, are you not?" "I am." "Yet your shoes tell a different tale. Those are not the scuffed soles of a tradesman, nor the polished leather of an idle gentleman. No, they belong to a man accustomed to movement, to travel, to the constant expectation of flight." Wainwright shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I conduct business across Europe." Holmes smiled faintly. "Quite so, and your reluctance to speak plainly suggests to me that this business is of a rather more delicate nature than the selling of goods. Tell me, sir, do your pursuers stalk you for the value of your wares, or for the knowledge you carry?" A flicker of unease passed over Wainwright's features, and Holmes caught it instantly. "Ah," he said softly. "So, it is the latter." Wainwright exhaled slowly. "Mr. Holmes, if I speak openly, I need your absolute discretion." Holmes waved a hand dismissively. "Come, sir. You have already risked your life stepping through my door. You may as well finish what you have started." Wainwright hesitated, his fingers drumming against the arm of his chair. I could see the conflict warring within him, the instinct for self-preservation against the realization that, in Holmes, he had found the only man capable of untangling his predicament. Holmes, however, was in no mood to wait. "Your hesitation, Mr. Wainwright, is most instructive," he murmured. "You are not merely a man pursued. You are a man who has been trained to evade pursuit." Wainwright's head snapped up. "What?" Holmes gave a knowing smile. "Your posture betrays you. You keep your back to the wall even now. Your coat is tailored to conceal more than just your frame. It has the discreet weight of a hidden pocket, no doubt carrying something of interest. And then there is the matter of your injuries." "Injuries?" Holmes gestured toward the man's wrist, where the faintest shadow of a bruise peeked from beneath his cuff. Not the work of common street ruffians. That was the grip of a trained professional, someone attempting to subdue you, perhaps. Wainwright's mouth set into a firm line. "You see too much, Mr. Holmes." Holmes leaned back, utterly unconcerned. "It is what I do." The room was silent for a moment. Then Wainwright sighed, his shoulders dropping slightly. "Very well," he said. "You win. But I warn you, Mr. Holmes, what I'm about to tell you could make you a target as well." Holmes merely smiled. "My dear sir, I should be quite offended if it did not." Wainwright ran a hand through his hair, the nervous energy that had flickered beneath his surface now spilling into the open. "I am not merely a businessman, Mr. Holmes. I was an intelligence operative for the United States." I felt my breath catch. A spy. It was not the first time we had encountered men of such persuasion, but it never failed to introduce an air of danger. Holmes, however, seemed wholly unsurprised. "Go on." "I was sent to London with information of great importance, documents detailing covert operations that could change the balance of power between nations. My contact here was a British intelligence officer. We were to meet 2 nights ago." Holmes steepled his fingers. "And yet, I suspect you did not." Wainwright's expression darkened. "Number. When I arrived at our meeting place, he was already dead." I stiffened. "Murdered?" "Yes." Wainwright exhaled. "Shot, clean and precise. Whoever did it was a professional." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And the documents?" "Gone." "Ah." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "So, let us review. You, an American operative, arrive in London to meet a British agent. Said agent is found murdered. The documents vanish. And now you are being pursued by persons unknown." Wainwright nodded grimly. Holmes tapped a thoughtful finger against his chin. "Tell me, Mr. Wainwright, why do I have the distinct impression that you are still holding something back?" Wainwright hesitated. "Because I am." Holmes smiled. "Good. I do so love a challenge." The alleyway was narrow and damp, the air thick with the acrid stench of coal smoke and the decay of the city. The glow of a distant street lamp flickered feebly, illuminating the huddled shape of a man lying motionless upon the cobblestones. Inspector Lestrade stood nearby, his hands deep in his coat pockets, his expression grim. "I suppose you've already drawn your conclusions, Mr. Holmes," he remarked dryly. Holmes knelt beside the body, his keen eyes sweeping over the scene with an intensity I had seen many times before. "A man's death is rarely a simple matter, Inspector," he murmured. "It is, however, often instructive. The victim was a middle-aged gentleman, well-dressed but dishevelled, his coat crumpled as though he had fallen in haste. His right hand lay curled inward, frozen in its final grasp. Holmes reached into his own pocket and produced a magnifying glass, scanning the man's fingers with interest. No defensive wounds, he noted. No signs of a struggle. He glanced up at Lestrade. This was not a street robbery. Lestrade scoffed. And how do you know that, Mr. Holmes? Holmes tapped the victim's polished boots. Because, Inspector, our unfortunate friend here is still wearing shoes worth more than a month's wages of the average London thief. Now tell me, was anything taken from his person? Lestrade hesitated. His wallet was found untouched, but there was something missing. The landlady swears he had a letter when he left the house, a note of some sort. Holmes exhaled softly. Ah, now that is interesting. Holmes did not move from his place beside the body, but I saw his brow furrow slightly, a sure sign that his mind had latched onto something unseen. He studied the man's lifeless hand again, his fingers tracing the way the thumb and forefinger curled inward. A most curious detail, he murmured. I leaned in, seeing nothing beyond the rigid grip of a man who had met a sudden and untimely end. What do you observe, Holmes? Instead of answering me directly, Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew his pocket notebook. With a swift movement, he plucked a loose sheet of paper from its pages and placed it gently between the dead man's fingers. Consider, he said, his voice almost absent-minded. If a man is holding something when he dies, his fingers will remain closed around it. And yet, if something were forcibly removed after his death, the hand would retain this very posture, a memory of its last act. Lestrade's face darkened. So you mean to say that the letter was taken? Holmes rose smoothly, dusting his hands. Not just taken, Inspector. Taken after our unfortunate friend had breathed his last. His eyes glinted. Someone knew he carried something important, and they ensured it did not remain in his possession. Lestrade muttered a curse under his breath. And what do you suppose was in that letter? Holmes smiled faintly. Something worth killing for, I should imagine. Holmes took one last look at the body, then turned his attention to the ground around it. He stepped lightly over a puddle, crouching by a patch of disturbed gravel. Watson, he said, what do you make of this? I bent down beside him, peering at the faint impressions left in the dirt. They were unlike any I had seen before, crisp, deliberate, with a uniformity that struck me as unnatural. Boot marks, I said, but strangely even as if the wearer was accustomed to precision, Holmes finished for me. And not just any precision, Watson. Military. Lestrade snorted. You deduce all that from footprints, Holmes? Holmes straightened, his expression unreadable. Not merely from the prints, Inspector. Consider the nature of the crime. The body displays no signs of hesitation or brutality, no unnecessary force, only the absolute minimum required to achieve the objective. A swift, clean kill, the removal of the letter, the absence of struggle. I felt a chill run through me. A trained killer. Holmes inclined his head. A professional without a doubt. Perhaps even a man of intelligence, British, American, or otherwise. He dusted his hands and turned to Lestrade. This was not the work of a common criminal, Inspector. This was an execution. Lestrade's face darkened. Then God help us, Holmes. If spies have started killing on the streets of London, what are we to do? Holmes glanced down at the dead man one last time before murmuring, Why, Lestrade, we do what we always do. We catch them. Holmes's energy was at its peak when deception was required. By the time we arrived at the offices of British intelligence, he had assumed the persona of a fussy bureaucrat with such convincing authenticity that I found myself momentarily forgetting the man beneath the act. "I understand there has been some regrettable misplacement of sensitive documents," he informed the clerk in a tone of exasperated authority. "You would not believe the incompetence I have encountered this week. I need access to the records office immediately, unless, of course, you prefer this oversight to reach the higher levels of administration." The clerk, a thin man with a perpetually worried expression, blanched. "Oh, certainly, sir. If you'll just sign here." "Later, later," Holmes snapped, waving a dismissive hand. "Time is of the essence." We were admitted without question. Once inside, Holmes strode directly to the file drawers and ran a finger over the labels, his sharp eyes darting across names and dates. Then, with a small noise of satisfaction, he withdrew a folder and flipped it open. "Watson," he murmured, "we are about to make the acquaintance of a most interesting gentleman." The name on the file read Edgar Lennox. Holmes scanned the file with a quick but thorough eye, his expression unreadable. I peered over his shoulder, noting official reports stamped with the insignia of the Foreign Office. "Edgar Lennox," I read aloud. "Who is he?" Holmes tapped the page. "A high-ranking intelligence officer with ties to diplomatic affairs. But more notably, Watson, it appears he spent considerable time in Washington and New York before returning to London last year." I frowned. "And you believe he is connected to Waywright?" Holmes turned a page, revealing a typed memorandum. He read aloud, "Lennox, surveillance recommended. Suspected of covert dealings outside official channels. Possible American involvement." The words sent a chill through me. So British intelligence suspected one of their own. "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "And yet, here he is, missing from all recent correspondence, his whereabouts unaccounted for." He closed the folder with a soft snap. "Which leaves us with a most pressing question, Watson." "And what is that?" Holmes slipped the file back into place and turned to me with a glint in his eye. "Whether Edgar Lennox is a man running for his life, or a man ensuring his secrets remain buried." Holmes stood by the hearth, holding a telegram that had just arrived. His sharp eyes skimmed the message, and I saw a flicker of interest cross his otherwise impassive face. Without a word, he passed it to me. It was from an informant within the Intelligence Bureau, and it contained a single jarring sentence. "Edgar Lennox has vanished." I looked up in astonishment. Vanished? But how? He was under surveillance, was he not? Holmes was already reaching for his coat. "That, Watson, is precisely what interests me. A man of Lennox's standing does not simply vanish into the night without leaving footprints, unless, of course, he intends to." Within the hour, we were at the intelligence office, where the commotion was evident. Officials moved about in hurried clusters, hushed voices speaking of Lennox's sudden disappearance from his residence. There had been no sign of forced entry, no disturbance, just an empty room and an open window. Holmes absorbed these details in silence, then turned to the flustered officer who had briefed us. "Gentlemen," he said, "you are looking at this the wrong way. Lennox did not disappear. He removed himself carefully and deliberately. The question is, was it an escape or an erasure?" As we left the intelligence office, I could not shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. "Holmes," I said, "why would a man of his stature run? Surely he would have sought protection, not exile." Holmes clasped his hands behind his back, deep in thought. "Your question assumes he ran at all, Watson. Consider, If Lennox truly feared for his life, would he not have alerted his superiors? And if his disappearance was involuntary, would there not be some evidence of foul play? I frowned. Then you believe he orchestrated his own vanishing act? Holmes nodded, and with remarkable efficiency. There is no report of him withdrawing funds, purchasing passage, or arranging transport. Yet he is gone. That suggests preparation, and yet there is one element that remains unresolved. And what is that? The letter, Holmes said, the one Wainwright's contact was killed for. It vanished that same night, and now Lennox follows suit. That is not coincidence, Watson. That is connection. I felt a chill. Then Lennox either has the letter or knows who does. Holmes's lips curled slightly. Exactly. Which means, my dear Watson, it is time we brought his pursuers to us. I knew that glint in Holmes's eye well. It was the look of a man who had set his pieces upon the board and was now waiting for his opponent's next move. I shall need pen and paper, he announced, the moment we returned to Baker Street. A message must be sent, and it must be crafted with the utmost care. I watched as he composed the note with a meticulous hand, his brows furrowed in concentration. When he had finished, he passed it to me. To those concerned, the package has been secured. Arrangements must be made for collection. Instructions shall follow. There was no signature, no name, only a sense of cryptic urgency. You mean to impersonate Wainwright? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. Not entirely. I mean to impersonate the man his enemies expect him to be. Desperate, uncertain, and in possession of something valuable. That, Watson, should bring them to us. The note was dispatched through discreet channels, and then we waited. Night fell over Baker Street, and a tense silence settled between us. Then, at precisely midnight, there came a single knock at the door. Holmes leaned back in his chair, entirely composed. Ah, he murmured, right on schedule. The night was thick with mist as Holmes and I slipped into the shadows, trailing Wainwright through the narrow, winding streets of London. He walked with a careful yet deliberate pace, pausing occasionally to glance over his shoulder, though never once betraying any true alarm. Holmes had anticipated this meeting, predicting that Wainwright's supposed pursuers would make their move under the cover of darkness. I could not suppress a shiver as we followed him into the slums near the docks, a place where the law held little sway and men disappeared without a trace. Suddenly, 3 figures emerged from an alleyway ahead, their silhouettes stark against the dim glow of a gas lamp. Wainwright stopped, but instead of retreating, he stepped forward with the air of a man arriving at a long-expected appointment. Holmes pressed a firm hand against my arm, bidding me to stay silent. "Watch closely, Watson," he whispered. "We are about to learn the true nature of our client." I expected a confrontation, a desperate plea, a struggle, an attempt to escape. But Wainwright did none of these things. Instead, he spoke to the men in low, measured tones, his stance confident, his gestures unmistakably those of a man in control. Holmes exhaled softly. "Fascinating," he murmured. My heart pounded as I strained to hear Wainwright's words. To my utter astonishment, there was no trace of fear in his voice, only authority. "The matter is nearly resolved," he said. "The bait was taken, and our friend Mr. Holmes has played his role admirably. The only remaining question is whether Lennox is still in possession of the letter." I turned to Holmes, expecting some sign of outrage, but he remained perfectly still, his sharp eyes absorbing every nuance of the exchange. One of the shadowy figures, a tall man with a heavy accent, spoke, "And the detective suspects nothing." Wainwright let out a low chuckle. Oh, he suspects everything. But suspicion alone is not enough. He is following the trail I set for him, and when the time comes, he will reach the conclusion I intend. A slow dread settled over me. Waywright had not been a desperate man fleeing for his life. He had been orchestrating his own narrative, using Holmes as a pawn in a far more intricate game. Holmes's voice was barely above a whisper. He is not the hunted, Watson. He is the hunter. Waywright parted ways with his mysterious associates, vanishing into the night with the same calm certainty he had displayed throughout our acquaintance. Only then did Holmes emerge from the shadows, his expression unreadable. "Well, Watson," he said at last, "our client has played us for fools." I could scarcely contain my disbelief. But why? If he was never truly in danger, what purpose did we serve? Holmes began walking, his pace brisk. Consider what we now know. Waywright never needed protection. He merely needed to know if I could be turned into an unwitting instrument in his greater plan. Every move he made was calculated to test my deductions, to measure how closely I could follow the trail he laid. I struggled to reconcile the facts. Then Lennox. Was he ever truly a traitor? Holmes paused, his gaze distant. That, Watson, is the final question. Either Lennox had the letter and Waywright needed to remove him, or Lennox was innocent, and the true game was in ensuring that the world believed otherwise. A cold realization settled over me. Which means Waywright is still out there, playing both sides. Holmes gave a rare nod of admiration. Indeed, and for once, the great detective was merely a piece upon the board. His lips curled into a wry smile. I do believe I rather like the man. Holmes was at his most animated when the game reached its final stages. As we sat in our quarters at Baker Street, he composed a message with great care, pausing now and then to consider his wording. This, he remarked, holding up the note, is the key to drawing Waywright into the open. The illusion must be flawless. I leaned forward. And what does it say? Holmes read aloud, "To be delivered as arranged. The document is secured, but further guarantees are required. Meet at midnight. Usual precautions apply." I frowned. That is vague enough to mean anything. Holmes smiled. Exactly, Watson. Waywright will see precisely what he wishes to see. He believes himself beyond our grasp, but the promise of closure will be irresistible. The note was sent through carefully chosen channels, and the waiting began. The meeting was arranged in an abandoned warehouse by the docks, neutral ground where men of Waywright's ilk conducted their shadow dealings. Holmes, ever precise, coordinated with British authorities to have the area discreetly secured. "The moment Waywright enters," Holmes murmured, "he will believe himself victorious. And that, my dear Watson, is when he will fall." Midnight found us concealed in the upper galleries of the warehouse, the dim glow of lanterns casting long shadows upon the wooden beams. Holmes was utterly still beside me, his keen eyes fixed upon the lone figure that strode confidently into the meeting place below. Waywright had come alone. He moved with the air of a man in control, pausing to glance around the vast, empty space before removing his gloves with deliberate ease. A moment later, another figure emerged from the darkness, a man Waywright clearly expected. I recognized him at once as an intelligence officer of some repute, a man whose loyalties had always seemed to waver. "You're late," Waywright said coolly. "I do not like to be kept waiting." The officer inclined his head. "These are delicate matters." Holmes nudged my arm slightly, a silent signal to observe. I noted the way Waywright held himself, relaxed, assured, without the slightest sign of concern. He was certain that he had anticipated every possibility, that this was merely the last step in a game he had already won. "He thinks he is untouchable," Holmes whispered. "That is his final miscalculation." The conversation between Waywright and the intelligence officer was brief, laced with the veiled language of men who traded in secrets. Waywright extended a gloved hand. "The document." The officer hesitated, then produced a small envelope. But before Waywright could take it, a voice rang out from the shadows. "I should advise against that." Holmes's figure emerged from the darkness, his lean frame exuding quiet authority. Wainwright's expression barely flickered. If he was startled, he concealed it well. "Mr. Holmes," he said lightly, "I must commend you. You have a talent for appearing at the most inconvenient moments." Holmes smiled thinly. "And you, Mr. Waywright, have a talent for deception, but the game is over." At that moment, figures stepped out from the surrounding shadows, armed officers of the British government. Waywright, for the first time, showed the barest glimmer of uncertainty. Holmes stepped closer, his voice calm. "You are a man of many faces, Waywright. A patriot, a traitor, a ghost when it suits you. But tonight, you are simply a man with nowhere left to run." For a long moment, Waywright held Holmes's gaze. Then, to my astonishment, he smiled. "Well played, Mr. Holmes," he murmured. "Well played indeed." Wainwright's smirk had not faded, even as the officers stepped forward, their weapons drawn. He folded his arms with an air of supreme confidence. "I must say, Mr. Holmes, you do enjoy a dramatic entrance," he remarked. "But I'm afraid you've overplayed your hand." Holmes, unruffled as ever, took a slow step forward. "On the contrary, Mr. Wainwright, I rather think it is you who has been bested." Wainwright's gaze flickered slightly. "You have nothing." Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a small glass vial. "This, I believe, is the final piece of the puzzle." Lestrade stepped closer, peering at the vial. "And what, pray, is that?" Holmes held it up. "Ink residue, Inspector, lifted from the very cuffs of our esteemed Mr. Wainwright." He turned back to his captive. "You were exceedingly careful, I grant you, Wainwright. But a man's clothing tells a story, if one knows how to read it. This particular ink is of a distinct composition, identical to that which was used in the note our unfortunate victim attempted to leave before he was so rudely interrupted." For the first time, Wainwright's expression darkened. Holmes pressed on. "A minor oversight, but a fatal one. The missing note contained evidence that could not be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. You removed it, of course, but in your haste, you failed to notice the ink had transferred onto your cuff. A simple error, but one that places you squarely at the scene of the crime." Lestrade's men moved in. "I think that settles it," the inspector said. But Holmes, to my surprise, was watching Wainwright intently, as though waiting for one final move. Wainwright sighed, shaking his head with an air of regret. And here, I thought this would end more elegantly. Then, before anyone could react, he reached into his coat. Holmes lunged forward, but it was too late. A sharp click echoed through the warehouse, followed by an ear-splitting bang. Chaos erupted. A thick, acrid cloud of smoke exploded into the air, swallowing the room in dense fog. I staggered backward, coughing violently as shouts rang out. Figures loomed and vanished in the smog, the clatter of boots and the curses of startled officers mixing into the confusion. "Holmes," I called, my eyes watering. "Are you—" "I am quite unharmed, Watson," came his voice from somewhere to my right. "But I suggest you recover yourself quickly. Our friend is attempting an exit." I fought through the haze, glimpsing shadowed movement towards a side passage. But by the time the smoke began to clear, there was nothing but the faint echo of retreating footsteps. Lestrade, coughing and cursing, emerged from the mist. "Blast it! He's gone!" A younger officer rushed forward, panting. "Sir, the perimeter. He must have slipped through." Lestrade turned to Holmes, his face red with frustration. "Well, there you have it. A fine mess." Holmes, however, did not look the least bit dismayed. If anything, there was a glimmer of something close to amusement in his sharp eyes. "An escape worthy of admiration," he murmured. "A true professional's touch." Lestrade gaped at him. "Admiration?" The man made a fool of us. Holmes merely dusted off his coat. "Come, Watson, there is nothing more to be done here." We walked in silence for some time before I finally spoke. "You almost sound pleased, Holmes." Holmes clasped his hands behind his back. "Do you not find it invigorating, Watson? A mind that can match the game so well." I sighed. "But he escaped." Holmes glanced at me with a faint smile. "For now?" I frowned. "You mean to say—" "I mean to say, my dear Watson, that Wainwright's kind never truly disappear. Men like him exist in the shadows, moving from one game to the next. But make no mistake, our paths will cross again." He looked up at the night sky, exhaling as though in deep satisfaction. "And when they do, I shall be waiting." We returned to 221B Baker Street in silence, the weight of our failure pressing heavily upon me. Holmes, for his part, had settled into his armchair with a pipe, his sharp features composed, betraying not the slightest trace of disappointment. I, however, could not contain my frustration. "He slipped through our fingers, Holmes," I burst out. "After all that effort, after you deduced his entire game, he still managed to vanish into thin air." Holmes regarded me with mild amusement. "Vanished, Watson? No, he has merely postponed the inevitable. A man like Wainwright does not disappear. He lingers in the shadows, waiting for his next opportunity. And when he takes it, we shall be watching." I let out a breath and sank into my chair. "Still, I cannot reconcile it. You had him, Holmes. You presented irrefutable proof of his guilt. And yet, even knowing that, he showed no fear. He knew he would escape." Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke, watching it curl towards the ceiling. "Precisely. And that, Watson, is what makes him remarkable. Every move he made was calculated. Not just his escape, but every step leading up to it. Consider, for instance, the moment he first entered this very room. He presented himself as a man in distress, desperate for protection. Yet in truth, he was never the hunted. He was the hunter." I frowned. "Then why involve us at all?" Holmes's lips curved slightly. "Because he needed to know if I could see through him." The realization struck me like a blow. "He was testing you." Holmes nodded. "And, in a way, I suppose I was testing him." Holmes leaned forward, tapping the arm of his chair thoughtfully. "Now, Watson, let us dissect the performance, for it was a rather masterful one. From the very first moment, Wainwright's story was woven with inconsistencies." I nodded. "The wounds on his hands, they were not from an attack." "Precisely. He wanted us to believe he had narrowly escaped an assailant. But the injuries were too controlled, too deliberate. A man fleeing for his life does not pause to ensure his wounds are dramatic enough to be convincing." I rubbed my temple. "And his accent? You mentioned something about his voice." Holmes smiled. Ah, yes. The curious case of the shifting dialect. He softened his American accent just enough to sound like a man who had spent years abroad. But certain intonations slipped through when he was agitated, telling me that he was affecting it deliberately. Why? Because he wished to appear less experienced than he truly was. I shook my head in wonder. So every detail, the wounds, the way he spoke, even his nervous demeanor, was a fabrication. Holmes exhaled. Not a fabrication, Watson. A carefully orchestrated illusion. He wished for us to see a man in distress, a man desperate for protection. In truth, he was studying us just as much as we were studying him. I sighed. And we played directly into his hands. Holmes allowed himself a rare chuckle. We played our parts, certainly. But Wainwright miscalculated one thing. And what is that? That the game is not over. Holmes reached for a stack of papers on the side table and withdrew a single sheet, holding it between his fingers. And now, Watson, let us discuss the missing note. I sat up, intrigued. The one Wainwright's contact was killed over? Holmes nodded. The key to the entire affair, the note, which our unfortunate victim tried to conceal before his death, was never recovered. That alone should have struck us as highly significant. Consider, why would Wainwright, a supposed ally, make no effort to retrieve it? I blinked. Because he already had it. Holmes smiled approvingly. Just so. The note was the last remaining thread that could unravel his web of deception. Had it fallen into the wrong hands, British intelligence, for instance, it would have exposed his entire operation. And so, he ensured that it did not. I felt a slow realization dawn upon me. That's why he came to you. It was never about protection. It was about control. He wanted to ensure you weren't looking in the right direction. Holmes inclined his head. A magician's trick, Watson. Keep the audience focused on one hand while the other performs the true illusion. I let out a breath, shaking my head. Then all along, while we thought we were pursuing the truth, he was ensuring that we only ever saw what he wanted us to see. Holmes tapped the paper lightly against his palm. Indeed. And that, Watson, is the mark of a truly formidable opponent. I hesitated before speaking. Holmes, do you respect him? Holmes was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a faint smile, he murmured, in a manner of speaking. But respect does not mean surrender. I met his gaze. Then you still intend to pursue him? Holmes leaned back, his sharp eyes glinting. Oh, I should think so. The game, my dear Watson, has only just begun. Holmes tapped his fingers against the armrest of his chair, his expression one of quiet contemplation. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across his sharp features. I had seen him in many moods, triumphant, impatient, even amused, but never quite like this. Wainwright played his game with remarkable precision, Watson, he murmured. Every move, every detail, meticulously crafted. He walked into this very room not as a desperate man seeking aid, but as a tactician evaluating his opponent. And for a time, I allowed myself to be part of his design. I frowned. But why go through such lengths? He was already a man of intelligence, a spy with powerful connections. What did he gain from involving you? Holmes exhaled slowly. Control, my dear Watson. Control of the narrative. Wainwright did not merely deceive British intelligence. He directed them. He ensured that all eyes followed the trail he laid, leading precisely where he wished them to look. And who better to serve as the ultimate distraction than Sherlock Holmes himself? A chill ran through me. You mean to say, he sought you out, not to elude pursuit, but to define it. Precisely, Holmes said with a thin smile. By presenting himself as the hunted, he led us all to believe there was a larger predator in the shadows. While we chased phantoms, he secured his true objective, eliminating Lennox, disposing of the incriminating letter, and vanishing before the web could tighten around him. I leaned forward, feeling the weight of realization settle upon me. So, in the end, we were never hunting Waywright. Holmes nodded. No, Watson, he was hunting us. Silence stretched between us, broken only by the steady ticking of the mantel clock. I struggled to accept the truth of Holmes's words. We had been outmaneuvered, played as mere instruments in another man's elaborate deception. Holmes, however, seemed untroubled by the notion. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers before him. Holmes, I said at last, do you feel defeated? He arched an eyebrow at me. Defeated? No, Watson. Intrigued, certainly. Impressed even. But defeated? He gave a low chuckle. No, I do not believe I shall ever allow myself such a luxury. I shook my head in disbelief. Then you admire him? Holmes tilted his head slightly. Admiration is too generous a word, but I acknowledge his brilliance. Waywright is a rare breed, one who understands the game in its purest form. He did not act out of impulse, nor greed, nor desperation. Every decision was deliberate, every move calculated to its finest degree. Such men are few, and I would be remiss not to recognize the artistry of it. I let out a breath, and yet he escaped. Holmes smiled faintly. For now. I watched him carefully. You truly believe he will surface again? Holmes exhaled, watching the flames dance in the hearth. A man like Waywright does not disappear, Watson. He merely waits for the board to reset, and when it does... He turned to me, his sharp eyes gleaming. I shall be ready. The night air outside was still, but my mind remained restless. I had seen Holmes solve countless cases, outwit criminals and masterminds alike, yet seldom had I witnessed a contest so finely matched. Waywright was no ordinary fugitive. He had played his part to perfection, not merely evading capture, but orchestrating the pursuit itself. And while justice had been narrowly eluded this time, I could not shake the feeling that this was not the end of him. I glanced at Holmes, who sat in his chair, fingers steepled, gazing into the embers of the fire with an expression I could not quite place. It was not frustration, nor disappointment, but something else entirely. You seem remarkably untroubled, Holmes, I said at last. He did not look at me, but a faint smile played at his lips. It is not often, Watson, that one encounters an opponent truly worthy of the chase. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. I suppose that is a rare thing indeed. Holmes inclined his head. Rarer than you know. And with that, he fell into a pensive silence, his mind no doubt still tracing the invisible paths of the game. I had always assumed that Holmes derived his satisfaction from solving mysteries, from bringing order to chaos with the clarity of his logic. But as I observed him that evening, his expression alight with something akin to amusement, I wondered if it was not the solution that thrilled him, but the pursuit itself. You enjoyed this, didn't you? I asked, unable to suppress a wry smile. Holmes arched an eyebrow. A man does not lament the loss of a good game, Watson. He relishes the skill of his opponent and prepares for the next match. I shook my head. And you believe there will be a next match? Holmes exhaled, stretching his long fingers. Men like Waywright do not retire. They adapt, they evolve, but they never truly disappear. He is out there now, reworking his strategies, erasing his traces, setting the board anew. I shuddered at the thought. And what if we never cross paths again? Holmes finally looked at me, his eyes gleaming. Oh, we shall, Watson. That much is inevitable. For a mind like his cannot resist the call of the game. I had begun to prepare for bed when the familiar sound of hurried footsteps reached my ears, followed by a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson, ever composed, entered with a telegram in hand. "For you, Mr. Holmes," she said, setting it on the table before withdrawing. Holmes, who had been absent-mindedly plucking at his violin, abandoned the instrument at once and reached for the envelope. I watched as his eyes flicked over the words, his lips curling slightly at the corners. I waited, but he did not speak. "Well," I prompted, "is it from Lestrade? Another case?" Holmes tapped the telegram against his fingers, his expression unreadable. "It would appear," he said at length, "that our elusive friend is not content to remain in the shadows for long." A chill ran through me. "Waywright?" Holmes merely handed me the slip of paper. The message was brief, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "You read the board well, Mr. Holmes, but the game is far from over." Holmes let out a quiet chuckle, folding the telegram neatly before setting it aside. "How very predictable," he murmured. I swallowed hard. "It's a challenge, isn't it?" Holmes smirked. "A promise, Watson, a promise that the game shall continue." I exhaled, already weary at the thought. "And what do we do now?" Holmes reached for his pipe, a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. "We wait, my dear Watson, and when the pieces move once more, we shall be ready." The fire crackled, the city beyond our window humming with unseen mysteries. The chase was far from over. Holmes leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingertips together as he stared into the fire. "You see, Watson, deception is an art, but like all arts, it is never without its flaws. Waywright played his role superbly, yet even the most skilled performers leave traces of the truth behind." I sighed, shaking my head. "And yet, he escaped. Does it trouble you, Holmes?" Holmes's lips curled into a knowing smile. "On the contrary, my dear Watson, it delights me. A mind as keen as his will never be content to remain in obscurity. He will surface again, and when he does, we shall be waiting." I considered his words, then chuckled softly. So, in the end, Wainwright's greatest mistake was underestimating the patience of Sherlock Holmes. Holmes exhaled a thin wisp of smoke from his pipe. Perhaps, or perhaps his mistake has yet to reveal itself. His sharp eyes met mine. "Tell me, Watson, if you were in Wainwright's position, what would your greatest fear be? Now, I turn the mystery over to you, dear reader. What do you think was Wainwright's biggest mistake? Was it his overconfidence, a miscalculated risk, or something Holmes has yet to uncover? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this case, don't forget to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes mysteries and share this story with a fellow detective. The game is afoot.